Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're so excited to talk about resilience. And this is an installment of our Workplace EQ webinar series. And just want to say thanks to everybody who's joined, and I'll introduce ourselves as well to talk through things. But we're so glad you're here. We're so glad to talk about this topic. And everybody on the line, I think, shares the goal of making their workplace a better place by improving themselves, by improving their mental health. And that's a goal I think we can all get behind. So I'm so glad that we're here to talk about it today. Just a couple housekeeping things. You do have the chat available to you that you are able to use to ask, post comments or discuss with each other. There's also a Q&A that you have access to, and you'll be able to post questions there. We'll try to pick up some of those questions as we go, but the plan for today's meeting is to do 30 minutes of presentation and talking through things. We'll try and answer some of the questions as we go, but any questions that we don't get to, we have an extra 15 minutes slotted at the end of the presented material where we can go through that and any additional questions that people have. So feel free to throw them out as they come to you. We'll get to them as we can, and if not, we'll address them at the end. We will be recording this session, and so this recording will be made available to everyone who's registered after the fact, so you'll have access to that as well. So to start us off, I'll just go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Grant Keaton. I run lifecycle marketing at Tasha Health. We offer a mental health benefit to employers where employees can access mental health resources, including online sessions with licensed therapists. I'm so excited to have on the line with me today Tasha Jackson. She has a PhD in psychology. She is a clinical director at Tasha Health and also keeps up her own caseload of clients and meets with them throughout the week to keep her skills sharp, and is just one of my favorite humans I've had the opportunity to meet and interact with. So we're so excited you're here to talk with us today, Tasha.
Oh man, thanks, Grant. I'm looking forward to chatting about this with you today.
Cool. So why don't we go ahead and talk through the goals for today, Tasha? We can kind of discuss where we're headed and what we hope to cover.
Absolutely. So a couple of goals for today, obviously sort of at a high level, we're going to talk about resilience, but to do that, we're going to accomplish a couple of things. We're going to learn about what does it mean to stay healthy and effective during tough times, which is really, I think, at what the heart of resilience, right? How do we continue to operate at our best and be healthy during challenging times? We're also going to identify or talk about, like, when is it appropriate to slow down? When do we need to rest or spend some time in reflection or downtime? And so we'll chat about that. Talk about identifying our strengths, figure out when we need to pull on those, where we need to lean into those a little bit. We're going to also talk about some ways to preserve our relationships when stress is high. We know that when we're perhaps not at our best or under a lot of pressure, sometimes the relationships that we're in can experience the impact of that. And then lastly, we're going to identify or talk about how to figure out what coping strategies work and which ones don't. Lots of us carry on coping strategies that have worked perhaps in the past and have had varying degrees of effectiveness. And so we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about how do we figure out what those coping strategies are and which ones we maybe want to let go of and replace with something different.
That's great. And I'm so excited to cover these topics. Tasha, you and I have talked a little bit about this. Often when we are discussing resilience or communication or self-care or any of these things that we're talking about, really what we're talking about is how do we just live a better life, right? People, they want to be happy. They want to have lives that are full and rich and meaningful and those kind of things, general mental health type things. But I think that target can kind of be elusive a little bit, right? Like, what is happiness, or what is this thing that we're after? So often we like to revisit kind of defining what does mental wellness mean? And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, as we're thinking about an idea like resilience, that what is the point of it, right? Why do we want to build our resilience? And I think part of the reason we want to build that is so that way we can live lives that we're at our best and we're living mentally well. Right. And so what does that mean? Right. It sounds really nice. I can totally get on board with it. But what is that really? So I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind when we think about what does it mean to live a life that is mentally well or of mental well-being. I think the first is the idea that it is filled with some fluidity, right? And so like the waves of the ocean, right? There's this up and down and this sort of current that comes in and sometimes it goes out. And being mentally well means that we have some buoyancy, right? That we can sort of navigate some of those waves and some of that current coming in and going out and not get sort of pulled under, right? And so we can live with some fluidity. Living a mentally well life also means that we've got some resilience, right? We're going to talk in greater detail about what exactly we mean by resilience in just a few minutes, but it's also a life with some clarity, right? Part of the reason why we're defining this is to be clear about what is it that we're working towards or trying to achieve. I think when we're living mentally well, we're living at our best from a wellness perspective. That also allows us or gives us the courage to be present in the moment. So many folks want to be present, emotionally present for the good stuff, right? The stuff that feels really good, those happy moments, those joyous occasions. But if we're living, again, mentally well, then we're going to be okay to be present in those moments that maybe are a little bit more uncomfortable, right? We're going to know that we've got the resilience, the ability to navigate, that we've got strengths to pull on, supports to lean on, that say like, okay, I can face this, right? This thing that's coming, like it might be challenging, but I know that I can manage it. And then the last piece being, again, really some of that peace and clarity, right? Again, that my life is not wonderful because it is free of obstacles or challenges. But because I have some obstacles and challenges in my life, I can have that perspective and really enjoy those good times. And that, again, leads me to some peace and some clarity around, again, my strengths, my ability to maneuver both the good times and the more challenging times.
Okay, I love this. Now, there's a few things in here that for me are catch me off guard, actually, a little bit. So I think one is this word of fluidity, right? When I think of mental health, or, well, I guess when I think of like me being happy and life being good, fluidity is not a word that I'd put normally in a definition, right? Of me being like life being good, right? And I think that kind of has a little bit to do with the last two here, where we're having courage to be present in the moment, in the comfortable and uncomfortable situations. Like I said, the good life is one that doesn't have problems, right? This is what we're thinking about. And then especially as we're talking about resilience, I feel like me and probably a lot of people who are out there listening too, when we think of resilience, we think of things like grit, things like just strength, and I'm going to overcome, do these, and I'm going to knock
Muscle your
over
way
these
through it,
mountains.
right?
Yeah, without any problems at all. But this is a little bit more about, I don't know, it feels like it's being okay with some of the problems rather than feeling like I have to fight things and overcome them all the time. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say it's a little bit of both, right? And so it is acknowledging that life does come with some challenges, right? And that sometimes we get hung up on the inability to accept that. We want to fight sort of the reality of it. We wish for things to be different. We're upset that they're not maybe how we envision them to be. So I think when we're living, a life of like mental well-being and fluidity, there's this acknowledgement like, okay, this is the situation. Maybe it's less than ideal, or it's not what I expected for myself, but this is a situation. And the resilience piece comes in to say, I know I've got the skills, the strength, the mental fortitude, the tools in my toolbox, the support, the relationships, the strategies, that kind of stuff to help me to navigate this thing.
And it seems like it may, and the fluidity aspect of it seems like it may be, it may require me to be flexible, I suppose, with the way that I meet those challenges, right? I feel like a lot of the time when the challenge comes, we think that's something that's especially challenging. The way that we address it is we just do more of the thing that we've been doing, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like in some cases it may be that we need to be ready to adjust
Absolutely.
strategy in that scenario.
Yeah. I mean, I think the fluidity comes with saying like there may be a time where doing more of the thing is the thing that needs to be done. There may be times, and fluidity allows us to say this thing has maybe worked for me in the past, like just grinning and bear it has worked for me, but it's not working quite as well anymore, right? And so the fluidity allows us to shift and say, yeah, that has worked. It's not working as well right now. And so I want to shift or move a little in my perspective and maybe consider some other ways of approaching this thing.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've had a question come in that's asking how for some tips and tricks for being present in uncomfortable moments. And I think that is something that we all kind of experience. We want to avoid those things versus trying to be comfortable in them. And I think we've got a slide later on when we're talking where we'll address that a little bit more directly. So if you ask that question, or if you're thinking it anyway, hang in there. We'll talk through some of that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So let's.
I think we will chat about that a little bit, but I want to just say that just to clear up like a little, I don't know, thinking that I think comes along with it. There is this belief that if we avoid this uncomfortable stuff, that it will go away. And if we shift our thinking a little bit to show some of that fluidity to say, when we can be in those uncomfortable moments, they actually tend to pass a little bit faster for us. And so it feels sort of, what is the word, like the opposite of what we think we should do, right? Our tendency might be to step away, and we'll talk about how to do this, but to step into that moment actually helps it to pass faster.
That's interesting. And I would say sometimes I avoid comfortable situations without any like goal in mind other than avoiding it, right? There's no strategy in my head where I'm like, if I ignore this, it will go away. It's more just like, I can't deal with this right now. Right? But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Sometimes sitting in it, being present in it is what will allow that situation to resolve versus me just kind of doing it or ignoring it or whatever. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly right.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about mental health in general. Let's talk about some of the specifics as it relates to resilience and some of the other things.
Sure. So I'd like to expand our thinking a little bit from resilience to think about what I like to call the 3 R's. And so what are the 3 R's? They include certainly resilience. We're going to talk quite a bit about that. Reflection and relationships. And what I think is important to keep in mind, and I want to impress upon folks as we're looking at this slide, is so many times we come to these types of talks or we read articles or books about resilience, and we think we have to singularly focus on the idea of resilience. How do I focus on resilience to build my resilience? I'd like to propose that certainly that is one strategy, right? And one way that we can address that. But there's a little bit more indirect ways that we can get there as well. And those are reflected on here. And so those will include reflection, and that's some of that internal reflection, and both with some of that uncomfortable stuff and some of the stuff that we maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with, and focusing on our relationships, right? And so again, we can focus on resilience directly. We can go right at it head first. We can also, again, spend some time in reflection and in relationships. And those will also help us to build our resilience. And we're going to chat, I think in just a few minutes, a little bit more about how exactly that happens.
Very cool. I think that's great. Yeah. So first one up, do we talk about resilience directly then?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. So what is resilience, right? I know that's like the question on everyone's mind, I'm sure. Resilience, I like to think about as more like a means or a way to get to where it is that we're trying to go. And again, the place that we think that we're trying to get to or want to get to is that place of living a life of mental well-being. And so resilience then is the mechanism or the tool or the way in which people are able to bounce back from adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Again, that's the way by which we do that. Some things to keep in mind as we're thinking about resilience. Resilience is about adapting. And I think that this is important to keep in mind that when I think back over the course of my life, or when I talk with clients about things over the course of their life, the things that worked for them, that help them to be resilient, to get through different or difficult times, have changed, right? And it's required them, the situation they've been confronted with have been different. The way that they've resolved them has had to change and adapt. So I think that's an important piece, right? To keep in mind that there's this piece of adaptation, right? That's going on when we're thinking about resilience. And so, right, again, when we think about it from an adaptation perspective, it's the process or capacity for or of outcomes of successful sort of adaptation despite challenging circumstances. So said differently, that we can get through these things. We just may have to think about them a little bit differently, maybe approach them a little bit differently, have a different perspective, but a couple of different things.
I think so this is, sorry, Tasha, I just want to pause you right here. This gets so stuck for me in my mind. It's adapting part. And again, I'm going back to where I'm coming from before. When I think of resilience, the things that come to mind are like when the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? And which means that when it's hard, we're gonna try harder. We're gonna do more. We're gonna get at it more aggressively, or getting the idea of like getting back in the saddle and that kind of thing. Again, it's in my mind, I've always thought of it as I'm just gonna do more of the same, but better, but stronger, but harder. But you know what I mean? Yeah. And what you're talking about, where this is adapting, is actually changing the strategy, right? Like looking at yourself maybe and how you've been addressing things and understanding a little bit where things maybe aren't working and where more is not better necessarily. More of the same is not what the situation calls for. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you've captured that just right there. So I think the piece about adaptation is the doing more could be the thing, but it requires an evaluation to say, in this situation, will more get me the desired outcome? Ask yourself, more of what? Have there been cost, personal or otherwise, associated with the doing of the more, whatever the more is? And that's not to say, again, that what you've done in the past you can't do anymore. It's just the sort of intentional reflection or evaluating of like, does this continue to work for me? And if not, making those adjustments or those adaptations.
So it sounds like there's a big component of self-examination, and I think that makes a ton of sense. One of the things, Tasha, and you and I have talked about this a ton, is the power of and, right? So do you want to, would you tell us would you share that? I think it would be perfect application for this situation.
Yeah, sure. So I came into knowing about this thing called the and a couple of years ago when I was going through probably one of the most challenging convergence of personal and professional stuff happening at one time. And in therapy was sometimes stuck on like, there's this one way and this one way of thinking or being or feeling. And my therapist would often share with me to say, is there room for an and there? To like sort of continue that sentence, to say like, I'm really struggling or something. And she'd be like, is there room for an and? And early on, I'd be like, no, that's a full sentence, right? Stop, period. And I got over time, I was able to get to this place where I could say like, I'm really struggling, and I'm doing the very best I can, considering the situation that I find myself in, or this confluence of factors that have come together that have really impacted my life. And so doing that allowed me to then have a little grace and compassion and empathy for myself and think about how I wanted to manage or maneuver through those scenarios a little bit differently than being stuck on like, I'm struggling and this is terrible. And I'm terrible as a function of it, right? And the world is terrible, and my work is terrible, and all of these things, right? And so, and opened up just a little bit of space for me to go almost like a sliver of light in the dark, so to speak, to open up some other ways of thinking that could help me to adapt to the situation I was in.
So opening up other ways of thinking, I think, is maybe the biggest factor here. So my and revelation had to do with my personal relationship with my wife, right? Where I thought that I could be the perfect husband, or I could take care of myself, right? Like I thought these things are always in conflict for me, right? Like I do what I think she needs me to do, or I can do what I need to do for myself. That I was using the or, but there can be an and there, right? Where I can be a great husband and I can take care of myself as well. In my mind, those were mutually exclusive things.
Yep.
And the and allowed me to see that, like, hey, there's room for both. There's room for an and they can both be true. So, like, a professional example might be, I'm struggling to find a solution for this problem, which means that I'm a terrible employee or that I'm not doing a good job, right? And that may be another situation where there's room for an and, right? I am struggling to find a solution to this problem, and I'm a great employee, and I'm really good at my job, even though I'm struggling with this. So I think some of the reflection that you were talking about before, and some of that examination, is what allows us to kind of weed out, like, well, this belief may be flawed.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that when we can adjust our thinking, when we can be flexible in our thinking, when we can evaluate our thinking, right, to say like, maybe there is a flaw here. When we can shift our thinking, we can shift our feeling set, right? And then we can shift our behaviors, and again, the way that we're managing or coping. And so, yeah, I think there's lots of power in evaluating our thinking to say, is this flawed, or is there room for an and to the sentence? Is it not just a period, but maybe it's a comma instead?
That's great. So a question that came in that I'm really excited to ask you, Tasha, because I don't know the answer. It says some scenarios are still or, right? Shouldn't there be some that are or? How do you know the difference when it should be an or it should be an and?
Well, I want to first sort of unpack the use of the word should. So whenever I work with clients, I hear, people tell me their stories, their narratives, and I hear lots of shoulds. Shoulds to me imply a belief about the way that things are supposed to be happening. And this, again, can be a flaw in our thinking, right? That I expect for things to be this way, and therefore they're not. And so I feel really whatever, right? The insert feelings. And so I often will work with folks, probably till they're sick of hearing me say it. So when they find themselves saying should, they switch it to say could. Right? Could, again, that's some of that, I think, adaptation, opening that up to say, could there be times where it's really just an or? Could there be times where it's an and? I would argue, and I'm sure we could maybe find cases where an or makes sense, but I would say, like, let's look at the word should and consider the possibility that even in the places where I think it's an or, there might be room for an and.
Mm. And to be fair to the author of the question, they did not say should. I answered that, so maybe that was my bad. But I think the idea still applies, right? We have a belief about the way the world is. I don't think it's necessarily to get 100% correct, like this is an or, this is an and. But just the exercise of examining it, of allowing the possibility that there may be other things that we haven't thought about, I think that is what opens things up a little bit and allows for that adaptation that resilience requires.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, right, doing the evaluation or the exercise to say, I'm experiencing this thing as an or, right? That's how you're experiencing it. In my mind and the way that I'm seeing and experiencing this, it's this or this. And asking yourself the question, is there room for an and? And the answer to that could be no. I'm not going to say unequivocally, absolutely not, it's always an and, but I think to your point, the exercise of asking yourself, is there room for an and? And in the story that I shared with my therapist early on, I was like, absolutely, there's no and. I probably would have said this is absolutely an or. And over time, I adapted and adjusted a little bit in my thinking. And now she can say, is there room for an and here, Tasha? Most often, the answer is yeah.
Yeah. So I think maybe just a slight call out here. Tasha is one of the most brilliant experts on mental health that I know. And she's already cited a couple examples of when she's talking to a therapist that's working through some of her things. And I'm telling you, as far as like thinking through some of these things, I didn't really, like, I still struggle with it, but I had no idea that it even existed before I talked to a therapist. So if there's real questions in your mind, like, I don't get it, I don't see what's going on, a therapist is a great resource to go to talk through some of this stuff, and they'll be really good at it. So we've spent a ton of time on this section here, and it's been great conversation. We're running really low on time, so we're going to try and cruise through some of the rest of this. Resilience can be learned. Let's talk about the next R in the. Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, before I get ahead, there's a personal resilience plan. Tasha,
it is a personal resilience. Yeah, and we'll certainly share this out afterwards so folks can see it. But I do believe that resilience is something that can be learned. And one strategy or tool that I've used with folks, used personally, to think about how do I build, again, if we're focused on the resilience part of the 3 R's, is this tool right here where it looks at 4 sort of key areas. And so I'll just talk through them super quickly. So the first one being supports, again, the people in our lives that help to keep us upright, that we lean on in difficult times. Strategies, like that thing that keeps us moving, like what are we moving towards and how do we plan to get there? Solution seeking over here being those actual behaviors that we can show or identify, like goal setting, like what are the goals that we're working towards and the specific steps that we're taking to get there. My favorite, sagacity over here, which is really just the wisdom that you gain from going through challenging times, right? And so, as I mentioned, I was going through a super challenging time, and one of the pieces of wisdom that I took from that is the value of this, the tool, finding the and things. So things to be, and again, it's going to require some reflection, some time thinking about. But certainly, these are some places that you can start if you're wanting to focus on the R or the resilience part of the 3 R's.
That's great. Very cool. Let's maybe jump into a couple of these others and see if we can knock out some tips and tricks.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've probably heard me mention evaluation or reflection or introspection a couple of times. And so one of the tools that I think is so helpful as we're thinking about resilience and how do I build that for myself is a practice that I call time in. And so time in is intentional, dedicated time where we're reflecting inward, we're looking inside of ourselves. We're focusing on perhaps body sensations or images that are coming up for us in our mind, or feelings or thoughts that we're having, and evaluating them, right? And asking, is there room for an and here? What did I do in that situation that was really helpful? What could I have done differently? What were some of the thoughts that I was having? What were the feelings that were coming up for me? Again, really being intentional about spending some time in your own inner world. There's a number of benefits, I think, to a practice like this. And we've outlined some here on the slide, but the ones that I think are super important really have to do with like our ability to connect internally with ourselves actually improves our ability to connect externally with the folks around us, and vice versa, right? And so a regular practice of time in can help to enhance empathy, our flexibility or fluidity, right? Because it gives us that chance to evaluate some of those thoughts that just come and then we're not even aware that they've influenced the way that we're feeling about something. So it provides some flexibility in our responses. We have some increased capacity for attunement, our ability to tune in and understand, again, what's happening with me? Why did I wake up on the wrong side of the bed? Or why are my shoulders feeling so tense? Or why did I just snap at my kid or my partner or whatever, right? It gives us the ability to sort of tune in with ourselves and figure out what's happening. And it gives us, I think, what's really important as we're thinking about resilience, the ability to approach rather than feel like we have to back away from challenges. Right. And so again, that internal reflection time, I think, can help us to do those things.
And this can be done in a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be sitting on a meditation pillow, although it could be, right? It could be while you're doing the dishes. It could be while you're driving to work, or exercising, or zoning out on your couch after the kids are asleep, or whatever it is, right? But I think the intentional examination and maybe curiosity is what makes that valuable time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think folks, we hear a lot about meditation and mindfulness and introspection. And I think we get an idea about what that means and what that looks like. And then we have to be on a big comfy pillow in the corner somewhere with the lights down low. And that, while that might be true for some folks, that's how they are able to have their time in. For other folks, that's not how or when they want to have that reflection time. And so can do it really anywhere, as long as there is again, that intentionality to be like, what's going on with me and within me.
That's great. So I know we're a little bit over time as far as the 30-minute mark. We've got one more topic to cover. Feel free to drop, of course. This is being recorded and we'll share it out with everybody. And then we'll still have a little bit of time at the end of this for some questions.
Yeah, and so the last sort of part of that triangle, right, our 3 R's. Again, we've got resilience, we've got reflection, the third part being relationships. And so how do we nourish or build on that particular part of the triangle? And I like to think about what I call the practice of connecting time. And again, this is going to involve our connections to other people and really lays a groundwork for both practicing and I think understanding what self-care looks like. So if anyone is familiar with attachment theory, it's Bowlby back from, he had the monkeys, right? And so the monkey wanted to go to the thing that was warm and soft, as opposed to like a fake monkey that was cold and not welcoming. So our attachment stuff, like our understanding was all the way back then. But 2 things that we know to be true of relationships, right? And the goal of them is attachment, is that in secure relationships, they can serve as both our home base, so that soft place to come back to in hard times, and also the launch pad from which we can move ourselves out into the world to take on risk or try new things, or be willing to experiment or go out, and see the world. And so it's important that we can invest in our relationships because they can provide both of those things for us. Again, that sort of safe haven and the launching pad, right, to go out into the world. And so having that safe haven, that launching pad, helps us to develop and practice, right? And I say practice, our empathy, our gratitude, our patience, again, our ability to risk take. I think some of these things, particularly like empathy and gratitude, maybe even patience, are difficult for us to do for ourselves. And so meaningful relationships are a great place to practice what that looks like, what that feels like, language to use to express it, and then to then be able to sort of internalize some of that.
And developing, it sounds like strengthening those relationships through those things. Obviously, if we feel like we've got a safe place to come back to, we feel like people who know and understand us as we face challenges, we'll be able to do that with a little bit more space, whatever, reserve in our tank, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about resilience, part of that is having this support network potentially that we are purposefully strengthening to have, as a shoulder to cry on, as well as like someone, like you said, to practice some of these things, like being grateful for those around you, and so you can in turn be grateful for yourself and the things that you do for yourself.
Yeah, and I think that our relationships can also sort of remind us of things that maybe we forget about ourselves in challenging times, about successes or strengths that we've had or skills that we've used or other difficult situations that we've navigated and how we've been able to do that. And so so that reflection that you're sharing, with the people who are close to you, they can, again, in times of challenge, give that back to you and say, hey, remember the time you did this thing that you didn't think that you could do? Sometimes we forget that, right? When we're in the middle of something, in the middle of a storm, so to speak.
That's great. That's awesome. So cool. Okay. So we've got the 3 R's, just kind of summary: resilience, reflection, relationships. We can increase our resilience by working on any of these things. And you brought that together brilliantly, Tasha. Thank you so much for walking us through each of those things. So we've got some time for question and answer. So if you've got any questions you've been thinking about, feel free to put them through on the chat or the Q&A. There was one that came through, Tasha, when we were talking about reflection. How is reflecting, or the time in that you described, how is that different than ruminating?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that reflection, again, is intentional in a way that we're wanting to evaluate and understand. Rumination, I think, keeps us sort of stuck in just looking at the problem, where I think reflection helps us to, again, step a little bit outside of that, to say, what could the solutions be? What is my thinking? What am I feeling? What's happening? As opposed to a sole focus on what is wrong here in this particular situation. I also would say that time in is intended to be time limited, right? And so we can't possibly be in time in all of the time, right? There's lots of other things that we need to be doing in our daily lives. And so some folks that I work with who struggled with rumination, we've done things like worry time or reflection time, where we've literally built it into their schedule. And when that thing that comes up that they've historically ruminated on, they'll talk to themselves and say, like, I hear you. I know that this worry is here. And at worry time today, I'll be sure to spend some time with that thought. And often, by the time worry time or reflection time or whatever arrives, that worry is less present.
I think of, for me, I think of like arguments, right? This is a classic one for me. Like, oh, I should have said this, or when they said that, it made me so mad, and I'll kind of engage with that and spin on it for a while, and it'll get me riled up and things like that. I think rather than like grabbing onto that speeding car and letting it drag you down the path, down the road or whatever
Mhm.
way. What you're talking about is maybe stepping back and looking at the car and saying, maybe being more observational, or like the act of deferring it, saying, "Hey, I'm going to think about this later." Maybe take some of the force out of those emotions. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that again, when we can have that awareness to say, like, what's happening for me? I'm finding myself ruminating. I think even sometimes identifying it and saying, like, what's going on for me that I'm ruminating. What am I feeling? What's contributing to that? Sometimes it's an old pattern, that we're stuck in. And so again, I think, like you said, being curious about that, being observational about it, to say like, all right, I see this thing happening. What do I want to do in this moment?
Mm-hmm. There was another comment related to that question that includes that maybe an attitude of kindness in the reflection aspect of it. Would you say that's in line with what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It is. Yeah, I think an attitude of kindness. I almost want to go as far as say like a place of non-judgment. Again, we're acknowledging it, we're seeing it, we're curious about it, we're observational. I know that you said a few minutes ago, Grant, about the value of chatting with a therapist, but this can be one of those places where you can share some of these thoughts with someone who's going to meet them with kindness, help you to practice what that might look like if you're not sure how to do that with yourself or for yourself just yet.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you are fixated, you're stuck on something small, that outside perspective can be extremely valuable. A friend or trusted somebody else, they can provide that, but a therapist they're trained to find it and to help you see beyond it and that kind of thing. So I think it can be so valuable.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions out there from you who are listening in? We'd be happy to talk through anything that's on your mind related to this, or if there's something else that's sparked a question, we'd be happy to talk about that. We've got a few more minutes. I don't see any others coming in, Tasha, so we may be able to conclude. Everybody who's joined, okay. There's a question. Why should I do therapy, Tasha?
What was the question?
Why should I do therapy?
Why?
Right.
Oh man, that's a whole nother webinar. I think the long and the short of it is all of us have an internal world, and the ability to have somebody enter into that in a non-judgmental, kind, compassionate, observational way, and to help you sort through all of the stuff that's going on in there is honestly invaluable. And as a result of that, we will have improved relationships, perhaps let go of shame or grief or trauma or sadness or any of these things that can plague us. And I can't think of a better gift that we could give ourselves, honestly. But again, the ability to just have somebody sort of like enter into your inner world that you allow in there and can help you to walk through that from a trained, non-judgmental, sort of curious perspective, I think can really be life-changing. And not even, folks often think like, I don't need to go to therapy, there's nothing wrong, right? But again, I'm not talking about it from like there's just something wrong with you. I'm talking about it that we all have an inner world of thoughts and feelings and behaviors and stuff that we can share with another person that can help us to untangle a little bit, to get us, if we're already feeling really good, to feeling even better.
That's great. Very good. Well, thank you, Tasha, so much for sharing with us your experience and your perspective on all of these things. And thank you, everyone, for joining and contributing with questions and listening in. And we will be sending out the recording of this webinar so you can refer back to it, share it, whatever you would like to do with it. We hope that this will allow you to make your workplace and your personal home life a better place, a more comfortable place for you and those that you care about. And we're excited to see you on the next webinar. Stay tuned. We'll be posting information about that on social and the regular channels. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.